In the summer of 1972, the quiet town of Hollow Creek was unsettled by whispers of Troop 413's planned camping trip to Alaska's remote Shadow Pine Woods. Led by Scoutmaster Greg Davis, respected yet stern, the small group of scouts set off their green uniforms stark against the deepening shadows of towering pines. Greg walked ahead, his rigid posture hinting at an unspoken burden, the weight of expectation heavy on his shoulders. Behind Greg trailed Paul Simmons, the assistant scoutmaster. Paul, usually soft-spoken and reserved, watched Greg carefully, eyes narrowed slightly, his jaw clenched in subtle frustration. It was no secret among the troop that Paul had coveted Greg's position for years, quietly seething beneath his helpful exterior. Paul's fingers twitched nervously around the handle of the old lantern he carried, the rusted metal creaking softly in rhythm with his steps. Bringing up the rear was Robert Andrews' father to Scout Danny Andrews. Robert's heavy footsteps crunched impatiently through dried pine needles, echoing his growing resentment. Robert had joined the trip unwillingly, his trust in Greg fractured after a recent accident that had left Danny injured, something he vehemently blamed on Greg's negligence. His constant muttering, low and bitter, made the air thick with tension. As the troop settled into their campsite, shadows lengthened and the chill of evening began seeping through the dense, silent woods. Scouts laughed nervously, setting up tents under Greg's precise instructions. Paul lingered nearby quietly, correcting minor errors Greg had overlooked, his tone subtly undermining the scoutmaster's authority. Robert watched from a distance, arms crossed tightly over his chest, eyes fixed coldly on Greg's every move. Nightfall draped Shadow Pine Woods in thick darkness, broken only by the flicker of a newly built campfire. Around its glow, the scouts settled, unaware of the quiet hostility simmering between the adults who led them. Greg stood silently, staring into the flames as they crackled and sparked, lost in thought. Paul watched him, eyes gleaming faintly in the firelight, while Robert's heavy gaze bore down upon them both. None of them noticed the figure silently observing from the edge of the woods, blending seamlessly into the darkened trees. The watcher stood motionless, patient eyes fixed unblinkingly on Greg, unnoticed and waiting. The campfire burned steadily, casting flickering orange light onto tense faces. Greg began to outline the next day's plans, his voice calm but authoritative. As he spoke, Paul shifted restlessly, his eyes locked onto Greg with growing irritation. Each instruction Greg gave was punctuated by Paul's quiet interjections, suggestions subtly posed as corrections. Scouts glanced nervously between the two men, sensing the thinly veiled power struggle. Greg paused mid-sentence, finally acknowledging Paul's interruptions. "Something you'd like to add, Paul?" he asked, voice deceptively mild. Paul straightened slightly, the lantern still clenched in his hand. "Just wondering if you've considered the northern route, Greg. It's safer, less rocky terrain for the scouts." Greg's jaw tightened imperceptibly, his gaze sharp as it met Paul's. "We've discussed this. The northern route takes longer. We're perfectly capable of handling the shorter, more direct path." "Capable?" Robert scoffed suddenly, his voice rough and accusatory. "Like you were capable of keeping Danny safe." The scouts tensed visibly, eyes wide in the fire's glow. Danny shrank back, embarrassed by his father's sudden outburst. Greg turned slowly to Robert, his expression carefully controlled. "We've been through this. Danny's accident was unfortunate, but not preventable." "Not preventable," Robert repeated bitterly. "You're negligent, Greg. Always have been. This whole trip is reckless." "Robert—" Paul started attempting to mediate, but Robert silenced him with a glare. "Stay out of it, Paul. You're just as responsible if something happens. All of you are," Robert said coldly, eyes moving over the gathered faces. Silence settled heavily over the group, broken only by the snapping of burning logs. The scouts exchanged uneasy glances, their excitement for the trip now overshadowed by anxiety. Greg's expression remained stoic, but his fingers clenched subtly at his sides. Paul turned away, frustration evident in his tense posture. Robert sat back heavily, gaze fixed darkly on the fire. At the edge of the woods, unseen, the watcher continued to observe, eyes glinting faintly in the darkness, silently tracking the group's every movement, every exchange of hostility, patiently waiting for the moment to strike. 20 years later, the quiet stillness of Shadow Pine Woods remained largely unchanged, the dense pines whispering secrets only they remembered. Wyatt Brooks moved silently through the forest, his steps cushioned by moss-covered earth. He was a hunter familiar with solitude, his eyes constantly scanning the surroundings for movement. But today, something beyond ordinary prey drew him deeper into the woods, a persistent sense of unease guiding his steps. Wyatt paused, kneeling down beside a cluster of weathered stones half hidden beneath a thick layer of moss. A strange feeling settled in his chest, compelling him to reach out and shift the stones aside. Beneath the debris, his fingers brushed something soft and worn, an object hidden deliberately, long forgotten. Carefully, Wyatt pulled it free, revealing an old weathered diary, its cover cracked and pages yellowed by time. Settling onto a nearby fallen tree trunk, Wyatt gently opened the diary. His heart quickened as he read the date on the first page, July 1972. He remembered the stories everyone in Hollow Creek did. Troop 413 had vanished here, their disappearance becoming local legend, unsolved and shrouded in speculation. The pages were filled with frantic handwriting, growing increasingly erratic as Wyatt flipped further. Accusations leaped from the paper, circling around familiar names: Paul, Robert. Each entry punctuated by the repeated mention of someone known only as J.L. Wyatt glanced up sharply, suddenly aware of the oppressive silence around him. The air felt colder now, the shadows deeper. Unease crept down his spine, making him glance warily toward the dense foliage, as if expecting someone or something to emerge. The diary trembled slightly in his hands as he rose quickly, determined to leave the eerie stillness behind. Yet, as he walked away from the sight, diary clutched tightly, Wyatt could not shake the sensation of being watched. Behind him, hidden by the dense undergrowth, unseen eyes followed his retreating form, waiting patiently as they had 2 decades before. Back in his modest cabin at the edge of Hollow Creek, Wyatt sat by the dim glow of an oil lamp, meticulously turning each fragile page of the diary. The frantic handwriting within spoke volumes of panic, suspicion, and an escalating fear that gripped its writer tightly. Names appeared repeatedly, halls circled vehemently, accusations against Robert scribbled hastily, but it was the enigmatic initials J.L. that drew Wyatt's attention most. Paul watching me constantly. He's sabotaging my decisions. Robert's anger growing violent. Read one entry, the letters shaky and rushed. Another entry stated simply, found footprints, someone else here, J.L. The initials appeared over and over, a persistent whisper, amidst the chaos of accusations, fear, and uncertainty. Wyatt leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples thoughtfully. Paul Simmons still lived in town now, a withdrawn, embittered man who rarely spoke to anyone. Robert Andrews had never recovered from the loss of his son Danny, becoming a figure of bitter isolation. Both had clear motives, their guilt plausible, yet the identity of J.L. nagged persistently at Wyatt's mind. He stood abruptly, pacing the cramped space of his cabin, the diary clutched tightly in his hand. Something felt incomplete, just beyond his reach, teasing him like a whisper at the edge of hearing. He paused by the window, staring out into the blackness where shadows stretched and twisted, conjuring ghostly shapes among the trees. Outside, the forest was silent, holding its breath, as if aware of Wyatt's discovery. In the darkness beyond the cabin's faint glow, the watcher observed quietly, unseen, listening to the soft creak of Wyatt's footsteps inside, patient. As ever, knowing the past had finally begun to awaken. The following morning, Hollow Creek greeted Wyatt with gray skies and a chill that felt heavier than usual. Determined to untangle the threads of suspicion woven through the diary, Wyatt set out toward Paul Simmons's isolated home. Paul's house sat at the edge of town, partially hidden by overgrown brush and neglected fencing. The porch sagged with age, the wood weathered and splintered. Wyatt knocked firmly, the echoes sharp and hollow. After a pause, footsteps shuffled slowly toward the door. Paul appeared, his face lined with deep creases, eyes wary and suspicious. Recognition flickered briefly in his gaze, before settling into guarded neutrality. "Wyatt Brooks," Paul muttered. "Been a long while. What brings you here?" "Found something you might want to see," Wyatt replied cautiously, holding out the diary. Paul's gaze narrowed sharply at the sight, his knuckles whitening as he gripped the doorframe. "Where did you get that?" Paul demanded, his voice tight-edged with something more than just surprise. "Shadow Pine Woods." Wyatt answered quietly, noting Paul's sudden pallor. "You were mentioned often. Care to explain why?" Paul hesitated, then motioned Wyatt inside reluctantly. The interior was dimly lit, cluttered with old newspapers and remnants of a life frozen in bitterness. Paul sank into a worn armchair, sighing deeply. "Greg made mistakes," Paul said defensively. "Dangerous choices. I spoke out, someone had to, but I didn't cause their disappearance." "Who's JL?" Wyatt pressed, observing Paul closely. Paul shook his head, visibly agitated. "I don't know. It wasn't me. Robert had more reason to act. He blamed Greg entirely, hated him deeply." Wyatt watched Paul carefully, noting the genuine fear behind his defensiveness. Doubt stirred uneasily in his chest. Something didn't add up. Outside, hidden behind a thicket of bushes across the street, the watcher patiently observed Wyatt's departure from Paul's home unnoticed and calculating. Waiting for the perfect moment, the watcher knew the truth was dangerously close now. Clouds thickened as Wyatt approached Robert Andrews' home, the sky darkening in eerie sympathy with his mood. Robert's small house sat grimly amid a barren yard, its appearance a testament to years of neglect. Wyatt knocked briskly, the hollow sound echoing into the empty silence. Robert answered quickly, his frame, now gaunt shoulders hunched as if burdened by decades of grief. His expression hardened at Wyatt's presence. "What do you want?" Robert growled, suspicion thick in his voice. "I found something in Shadow Pine Woods," Wyatt said evenly, presenting the diary. Robert's eyes flared with raw, unguarded emotion, pain mingled with anger. "Where did you get this?" Robert snapped, snatching it from Wyatt's grasp, flipping furiously through pages filled with frantic handwriting. "It implicates you," Wyatt explained cautiously. "Greg believed you wanted revenge." Robert slammed the diary shut, chest-heaving eyes blazing with decades-old rage. "Greg killed my son through his incompetence, but I never harmed them. I've lived every day haunted by their disappearance." "Then who is JL?" Wyatt pressed, noting Robert's visceral reaction. Robert shook his head bitterly. Greg had enemies. Paul was jealous and others resented his arrogance. Maybe the initials belonged to one of them. Wyatt studied Robert closely. Beneath his anger was an unmistakable torment, a grief so powerful it overshadowed the possibility of guilt. Wyatt began to question his earlier suspicions. Robert's fury was genuine, rooted deeply in loss, not guilt. As Wyatt left, Robert lingered in the doorway, clutching the diary with white-knuckled intensity. Neither noticed the quiet figure standing discreetly across the street, watching their interaction intently. The watcher smiled, faintly confident in remaining unseen, certain that suspicion would continue to fall on others safely hidden behind familiar trust. Nightfall descended rapidly, shrouding Hollow Creek in shadow as Wyatt returned to his cabin. He lit a lamp, its warm glow pushing back the darkness just enough to comfort him. Settling at his worn wooden desk, he carefully opened an envelope he'd discovered tucked inside the diary earlier, a collection of letters Greg had never sent. Wyatt unfolded the brittle paper, squinting at faded ink. Greg's handwriting was hurried, almost desperate. Each letter detailed unsettling occurrences, equipment, mysteriously breaking supplies, vanishing without explanation, mounting tensions carefully stoked by unseen hands. The words painted a disturbing picture of sabotage, pointing back at familiar faces, yet shedding no clear light on their true guilt. One particular letter caught Wyatt's attention. "Paul questions every choice, sowing doubt among scouts. Robert seethes openly, blaming me entirely, but neither seems entirely to blame. Someone else is orchestrating this, someone close, trusted, someone I've overlooked." Wyatt stared at the words, mind racing. Someone trusted, close, and overlooked. Who else could fit this description? He moved restlessly to the window, peering into the darkness. The vague outlines of pines stretched endlessly, their silent watch oppressive in its intensity. As he stood lost in thought, a sudden chill crept down his spine, a prickling sensation of being watched. Wyatt stepped back sharply, heart quickening. Outside, hidden within the thick shadow of the pines, the watcher stood motionless, observing Wyatt's every move through the cabin's faintly lit window. Silent satisfaction flickered briefly across their face, secure in knowing Wyatt had begun to unravel a carefully spun web of deception, one leading directly into a trap the Watcher had set decades before. The next morning dawned cold and gray, with a persistent drizzle that seemed to seep into every corner of Hollow Creek. Determined to gain insight from someone who knew Shadow Pine Woods intimately, Wyatt set out to find Jason Lambert, the local park ranger known for his extensive knowledge of the area's history and terrain. Jason greeted Wyatt warmly at the ranger station, his demeanor calm and reassuring. "Heard you've been asking around," Jason said kindly, pouring steaming coffee into 2 chipped mugs. "Figured you might stop by." Wyatt accepted the mug, grateful for its warmth. "You know about Troop 413, right? Found something of Greg Davis's in the woods." Jason's expression remained composed, betraying nothing but mild curiosity. Terrible what happened back then. Everyone wondered, but nobody ever knew the truth. "Greg wrote about sabotage," Wyatt said quietly. "Mentioned someone trusted and overlooked. You ever hear anything about that?" Jason shook his head slowly. No one considered betrayal at the time, not seriously. Everyone blamed Paul or Robert. But Greg had a lot of secrets, a lot of enemies, hidden grudges. Wyatt sipped his coffee, feeling oddly comforted by Jason's easy presence, unaware of the subtle deflection in the ranger's words. "Ever come across anyone with initials JL?" Jason hesitated briefly, a flicker of tension crossing his features so quickly Wyatt almost missed it. "Can't say I recall anyone specific. Could be someone passing through, maybe." Wyatt stood, thanking Jason for his time. As he stepped out into the cold drizzle, he couldn't shake the feeling he'd missed something vital. Inside the ranger station, Jason watched Wyatt leave, his face slowly shifting from calm reassurance to calculated determination. Carefully, Jason reached into his pocket, withdrawing an old monogrammed pen engraved with the initials J.L., running his thumb thoughtfully over its smooth surface. Determined to unravel the mystery, Wyatt returned to Shadow Pine Woods, his senses alert to every rustle of leaves and creak of branches. A sense of foreboding pressed against him, intensifying with each step deeper into the dense forest. The air grew colder, thicker, almost suffocating in its quiet intensity. Wyatt stopped suddenly, noticing something strange beneath a cluster of pines. Scattered across the damp earth lay fragments of old camping gear, tattered fabric from a scout's uniform, rusted tent stakes, broken pieces of equipment deliberately hidden. Kneeling, Wyatt sifted through the debris, his heart pounding as he uncovered clear signs of sabotage: frayed ropes, deliberately snapped tent poles, and half-buried evidence of a struggle. His pulse quickened, realization striking sharply. Greg's fears had been justified. Someone had meticulously planned their demise. But who? As Wyatt turned, slowly scanning the area carefully, his gaze caught on a glint beneath a patch of moss. Carefully brushing it aside, he uncovered an old weathered pen intricately engraved with the familiar initials J.L. The monogram stood stark against the tarnished metal, chillingly clear. Wyatt's breath caught sharply in his throat. "J.L." he whispered, dread pooling heavily in his chest. Jason Lambert. Before Wyatt could fully grasp the implications, a sudden sound echoed through the trees, a sharp snap of a twig breaking underfoot. Wyatt spun around, his heart hammering violently. Silence followed, heavy and menacing, stretching endlessly until Wyatt became aware of another presence, a familiar figure emerging slowly from the shadows, face calm and eyes calculating. "Hello, Wyatt," Jason said quietly, stepping into full view. "I was hoping we wouldn't have to meet again like this." Wyatt stood frozen, heart racing, gripping the pen tightly as Jason's gaze fell pointedly on it, a faint smile curling at the corners of his lips. Wyatt's throat tightened as Jason Lambert advanced slowly, his presence deceptively calm, almost casual. Jason paused, his gaze never wavering from the pen Wyatt held tightly. A tense silence filled the air, thickening with each passing second. "You figured it out," Jason murmured softly, almost regretfully, his voice unsettlingly gentle. "Took longer than I expected." "Why, Jason?" Wyatt asked hoarsely, his voice barely a whisper. "They trusted you." Jason's calm facade flickered momentarily, revealing deep-seated resentment. "Trust," he scoffed bitterly. "Greg never trusted anyone. always so sure of himself, dismissing advice, ignoring warnings. He led them straight into danger, blinded by his own arrogance. Wyatt stepped back slowly, careful movements measured against Jason's watchful stare. So you sabotaged them, made sure they never made it home. They needed to understand, Jason said, his tone turning colder, sharper. Greg needed to pay for his arrogance. The others were unfortunate casualties. Wyatt's mind raced, piecing together Jason's careful deceptions, the quiet helpfulness, subtle misdirection, always blending into the background. You set up Paul and Robert, made everyone suspect them. Jason's faint smile returned, chilling in its satisfaction. They made perfect suspects. Too emotional, too obvious. It kept suspicion away long enough. Wyatt's grip on the pen tightened painfully, adrenaline surging through him. He sensed Jason was waiting calmly, confidently for Wyatt's next move, certain of his own control. They were just kids, Jason, Wyatt managed, voice trembling with restrained anger. Innocent. Jason's eyes hardened, cold fury flashing behind his controlled expression. Innocence doesn't exist, Wyatt. Only power and weakness. Greg had power, misused it, and paid the price. Wyatt saw Jason's hand move subtly toward his pocket, a glint of metal catching faint sunlight. Every muscle in Wyatt's body tensed, instinct urging him to act swiftly or become another victim of Jason Lambert's hidden brutality. Wyatt's breath came in short, sharp bursts as Jason slowly withdrew a knife, its blade reflecting a sinister glint in the faint sunlight. Jason took a cautious step forward, his movements deliberate, calculated. Wyatt quickly glanced around, heart hammering, searching for any advantage. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Jason said softly, voice disturbingly calm, eyes never leaving Wyatt. You understand too much already. Wyatt backed away, mind racing desperately. You won't get away with this, Jason. People know, people believe what I want them to believe. Jason interrupted coldly, stepping closer. They've done so for decades. Jason lunged suddenly, blade flashing. Wyatt dodged narrowly, stumbling backward and nearly falling. Jason advanced steadily, eyes cold, movements precise. Wyatt seized a heavy branch from the ground, gripping it tightly as Jason circled calmly, assessing his prey. Greg was right, Wyatt gasped, eyes fixed warily on Jason's measured approach. You were overlooked, trusted, but you're nothing more than a predator. Jason's eyes narrowed dangerously. Greg was a fool, blind and arrogant. They followed him blindly, paid the price for his mistakes. Wyatt swung the branch wildly, forcing Jason back momentarily. They were innocent, Wyatt shouted, voice raw with fury. They trusted you to protect them. Jason lunged again, faster this time. Wyatt swung with desperate strength, catching Jason's shoulder and sending him staggering back with a grunt of pain. Seizing the moment, Wyatt tackled him to the ground, knocking the knife from his grasp. Both men grappled fiercely, the forest filled with harsh breathing and snapping twigs. Finally, Wyatt managed to pin Jason firmly, his weight bearing down heavily. It ends here, Wyatt gasped, adrenaline surging. Jason stared up at him defiantly, eyes filled with quiet fury and bitter defeat. For now, Jason whispered darkly, eyes burning into Wyatt's with a chilling promise. But it's never truly over. In the aftermath, Hollow Creek stirred with disbelief, whispers spreading rapidly through town as Jason Lambert's hidden crimes were finally revealed. Authorities combed Shadow Pine Woods, uncovering haunting evidence buried for 2 decades, laying long-held secrets bare and granting closure to grieving families. Wyatt stood quietly at the edge of the woods, watching as the last of the search teams packed away their gear. Exhaustion clung to him, mingled with a profound relief tempered by lingering sadness. The woods, once peaceful and inviting, now seemed permanently shadowed by memories of betrayal. A gentle touch on his shoulder startled him. Wyatt turned, finding Robert Andrews standing there, eyes filled with an old sorrow, finally softened by a measure of peace. Thank you, Robert said quietly. You've brought Danny home in a way, given us closure. Wyatt nodded slowly, words failing him momentarily. I'm sorry it took so long, he managed, eventually, voice heavy with the weight of uncovered truths. Sometimes the truth waits until we're ready to face it, Robert replied softly, turning his gaze back toward the woods. Healing comes after the darkest hours. Wyatt watched as Robert walked slowly away, shoulders lighter than he'd seen in years. He understood the truth of Robert's words, deeply feeling their quiet strength settling warmly within him. As Wyatt moved to leave, he felt a comforting presence by his side. Paul Simmons, quiet and thoughtful. Paul gave him a solemn nod, the shadow of old bitterness fading from his expression. Together they turned away from the woods, stepping onto a path toward healing. Wyatt glanced back one final time, the forest standing silent witness to everything that had transpired. He knew he would never forget, nor fully escape the haunting memories. But as they walked away, he found himself quietly hopeful for the first time in days. Evil might hide behind familiar faces, but courage and truth endured. Wyatt drew a steady breath, ready to embrace the future he would now rebuild one careful step at a time.